A wise man once said, "Nothing will kill a legacy more than expectations." This is true in sports, business, and definitely in the world of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Sometimes archetypes are released to incredible levels of hype and anticipation and actually end up meeting projections. Such was the case with Black Wings, Gadgets, and Dragon Rulers. But more often than not, we in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community build up yet to be released themes as world beaters, only to have our expectations shattered when said theme needs to perform and we realize that its destined dominance was nothing more than a figment of our imagination. When it comes to archetypes, there of course have been dozens of colossal flops throughout this game's history, and in this video I'm going to tackle the infamous legacy of, without a doubt, one of the biggest. I'll discuss this archetype's genesis, why it failed, and the competitive success it did have. This is the story of the biggest flop in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, Magical Musketeers. To begin our story, we have to go back to before the release of Musketeers in the TCG, or even the OCG for that matter. We have to start with the first reveal of the archetype itself. Konami first revealed Magical Musketeers on June 23, 2017. They only revealed 2 of the 13 cards that would premiere in the Spirit Warriors booster set, but with Yugioh and Casper, we learned 2 very important things about the archetype that instantly excited the community. Number 1, it appeared that all the monsters in the archetype shared the ability that lets you activate spells and traps from your hand. Number 2, they were column based. This looked promising because it meant they could trigger off of your opponent's cards, or that situations could arise in which your opponent was boxed into not using some of their cards for fear of giving you free valuable effects in the process. Both of course were positives. The ability Konami gave Musketeers that allowed them to use spells and traps from the hand at all times, to be honest, seemed too good to be true. Obviously it made their trap cards much faster than any other archetype in the games, and it also meant that Musketeers would rarely ever have to commit much back row to the field at all, so punishing the deck for that would be extremely unlikely. As the summer went on, more cards for the archetype were revealed. By early August, we know the entire arsenal of 13, but many in the community, especially Yu-Gi-Tubers, had already begun playing and testing the deck in mid-July. The early testing results of Musketeers, as well as all the perceived positives of the theme, are in my opinion what built the hype for the archetype. While of course no one is infallible, I'll straight up admit it, we Yu-Gi-Tubers flat out got this one wrong. The builds were all over the place, the opponents were questionable at best, they often didn't know how to punish the deck, and we ignored glaring flaws in the Magical Musketeer archetype, presumably because it can make a lot of advantage under certain circumstances. This of course led to outlandish statements about how good the deck was going to be competitively.
Magic bullets. Magic bullets will be the next Zoodiac. With that statement, I mean that magic bullets are definitely going to be maybe the next, or one of the next tier 1 decks coming out soon.
But again, people are just quitting left and right. This deck, I think it's the best deck right now. Like, I think we've established this. I told you guys, this deck is on some next level. It's like tier negative, alright? This deck, so good.
As my title suggests, the deck would not come close to accomplishing any of these feats. I'll also throw myself under the bus. I said things like, I'm all in on this deck and this is incredible, etc, etc. For the record, that's exactly how something gets undeserved hype. As previously mentioned, Magical Musketeers could make advantage incredibly easily. Caspar, Kid Brave, and Starfire could all net you a very easy +1 in your first turn. Starfire especially got the advantage snowball really going, as she would usually summon Caspar from the deck so you could trigger him as well and start the duel with a quick +2. Triggering your Musketeers turn 0 was relatively easy with the Tune Engine, Ties of the Brethren, and Double Summon. All of these spells help you garner advantage and usually led to you having more Musketeers on field to trigger later. Musketeers also had an impressive array of spells and traps which were all searchable by Caspar. These effects ranged from a spell card that doubled their attacks, a simple destruction card for any face-up your opponent had on the field, to even a card that negated a face-up monster's effect and made said monster 0 attack. At the time, this spell and trap pool appeared to be one of the best and most versatile in the game. as it really seemed like Musketeers had a strong card for every situation. This is how the false sense of security was built with this archetype. When looking deeper and thoroughly playtesting the deck, and I must emphasize thoroughly, some smart duelists realized the archetype was littered with problems. First was the obvious but forgivable low attack problem. This is something intentionally done to some of our best archetypes each year, so I don't think it was the biggest deal. As long as you have strong card effects, then attack points don't matter, right? Until they do. The fact that almost every monster in this archetype topped out at 1500 attack meant that in nearly every situation you wanted to kill a monster, you'd be forced to use a valuable spell or trap. Obviously, never being able to run over your opponent's monsters in battle and save your spell and traps for their problem monsters is not ideal. The second major problem for the deck was the hard once per turn on all the spell and traps. Cards like Desperado and Cross Domination were absolutely amazing against every deck, but there were many situations where you really needed to be able to use more than one copy in a turn. The third major issue is one that the deck still struggles with to this day. Magical Musketeers are completely normal summon reliant. The deck had zero ways of special summoning from the hand in any capacity. If your normal summon were to get negated, for example, your turn would basically end. While this can be said for a lot of control decks in Yu-Gi-Oh!, the difference between those decks and Musketeers is that all the spells and traps in this archetype require a face-up Musketeer on field. Translation, if your normal summon got interrupted, all your spells and traps would be turned off too, making your situation exponentially worse. These issues should have been giant red flags to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community, so they would maybe pull back a bit on the whole tier 1 meta stuff, but again, not many did enough thorough testing to realize these flaws. When Musketeers premiered in the OCG around mid-August, the deck was a next level flop. Throughout that format, True Draco and Dinosaurs were, let's say, co-tier 1, and the quote-unquote best deck between those two really depended on what week it was. As fate would have it, Magical Musketeer had an absolutely horrible matchup against both decks, so it really didn't matter. Defeating True Draco was a near impossible task, especially considering a tribute summon masterpiece that was unaffected by spells and traps basically beat the entire deck. Your two most important removal cards were useless to stop it, and even with the additions OCG duelists made to the deck, such as Eater of Millions and Instant Fusion, the latter serving as Thousand Eyes Restrict, Masterpiece could simply pop both cards before they threatened him. Let's also add in Skill Drain was and still is unlimited in the OCG, and it was basically another auto win card against Musketeer. Not only did it negate all the +1 effects of the Musketeers, but it also turned off the deck's ability to activate trap cards from the hand. The Dino matchup wasn't much better. To quote, well, basically everyone at this point, have you read Mist? It takes away all interactivity with dinosaurs, and unfortunately, Musketeers had no way of stopping or mitigating that effect. If the dinosaur player didn't have Miscellaneous Source, Lost World was usually just as good. With a dinosaur token on field, the Musketeer player would lose the ability to use Desperado or Cross Domination completely against any Dino monster, as both of those cards targets. As bad as all that sounds, Musketeers didn't even have a legitimate edge against the OCG's third best deck. The ABC matchup was very difficult, specifically because targeted removal cards weren't exactly great against an archetype of non-hard once per turn monsters that float. This was also one of the matchups where attack points mattered. The Musketeers were rarely big enough to straight up attack over the ABC pieces. This meant that you usually had to use removal cards to get rid of them and didn't always have them when Big Boss Dragon Buster hit the field. The fact that Dragon Buster could completely dodge targeting effects during their turn also didn't help. To say Musketeers' release was a disappointment would obviously be an understatement. It wasn't close to beating the top 3 decks in the OCG reliably, and I'd also like to point out Magical Musketeers actually had a stronger card pool to work with in the OCG. This is because Upstart Goblin was unlimited there. TCG builds were expected to have to rely on Toon Table of Contents. Toon Table was a serviceable substitute, assuming you didn't draw any of the Toon cards in multiples, but it clearly wasn't as good as Upstart Goblin, which served the same exact purpose. Upstart Goblin could put you closer to your non-searchable cards, and more importantly, it could get you closer to your side deck options. It also didn't require you to run any additional cards as an engine. When mid-July rolled around, Spirit Warriors was finally released into TCG, and it would be our turn at bat. By this time, the competitive expectations for the deck were a far cry from the initial ones made back in July. Everyone had seen the woes of the archetype and its lackluster performances in the OCG. There were a few recorded regional top 8 finishes in the first couple of weeks within its release, but surprisingly, even some of those players who saw success with the deck were fairly blunt about how average the deck actually was.
What's up, guys? We're here with RIW sponsored player Richard Waddle, who just got top 8 at the Toronto Regional with
Magical Musketeers.
best deck.
Yeah. This deck is so bad that you need cards that just give you wins when you draw them. And like, yeah, this card can be bad, but like you need to play cards like this so that you win on your good hands.
At YCS San Diego, which was the first YCS Musketeer were legal for, it didn't place a single duelist in the top 32 cut. Musketeers that look great in replay videos posted by Yugitubers back in the summer, but when put on the primetime stage, the deck was simply getting clapped by the meta decks of Trickstar, Pendulum Magicians, and Spiral. There was one bit of solace, as in a round 2 feature match, its ceiling and what it was capable of when things went right were on full display. Most of this was admittedly achieved through locking down the opponent under Rivalry of Warlords, but it was still nice to see nonetheless. This could have been the end of the Magical Musketeer story, which to this point had pretty much been a competitive dumpster fire. However, if you know the German folklore, you'd know that there was still one more musketeer to come. In the opera Dear Fright Shoots, a marksman named Max is deeply in love with a woman named Agathe. He wants to marry her, but first needs to prove himself in a shooting trial. In doing so, he would succeed her father as head forester. With that being said, his biggest problem is he's not exactly the best marksman and doesn't have a lot of time to get better. Caspar, Max's close friend, had actually wanted to marry Agathe herself, but she had already rejected him for Max. Enraged, Caspar secretly plots his revenge against Max, Agathe, and her father. Caspar seeks out to find Max, who is wallowing in self-pity, and hands him his gun. He tells Max it's loaded with a magic bullet that will allow him to hit anything he wants. Max fires the gun and hits a bird soaring high in the sky. He's absolutely astonished. Max is convinced that with these bullets he can pass the trial. Caspar persuades Max to meet him at Wolf's Glen at midnight, where he'll give him 7 more magic bullets. 6 will hit whatever target he chooses, but the last will be guided by evil. Max takes these bullets, in doing so, unknowingly selling his soul to the devil, who Caspar had already made a deal with and had 1 day left to deliver a new offering. Without giving everything away, that's a brief summary of the Magical Musketeer lore. As promised in the lore, Konami gave us Magical Musketeer Max in the OCG's Link Brains Pack 2. Max was an absolute beast and one powerhouse of a monster. He was a Link 1, so any Musketeer could instantly summon him. He had 2 super solid effects, one that could add multiple spell and traps to your hand, and another that would see you summon multiple monsters from your deck. Max also helped immensely with going second, as it gained advantage the more your opponent committed to the field. He didn't really help at all with going first place with the deck, but he was more than enough to give the deck a nice boost. Konami also paired Max with Magical Musket Crooked Crown, released in Dark Neostorm. This gave Musketeers the much needed ability to special summon monsters from the hand. As solid as Max and Crooked Crown were, it may have just been too late by the time Link Frames 2 was released in the OCG in late November 2018. Rusty Bardiche was clearly the superstar of that set, and the OCG metagame was filled with the likes of Sky Striker, Goki, and Astrograph Pendulum Magicians at that time. Magical Musketeers simply were no match when compared to those decks. They would still have some tops in the OCG shortly after Max was released, but never enough to make a wave in the metagame. In the TCG, Musketeers would actually see much more success post the release of Max in 2019's Battles of Legends booster set in July. Musketeers would reach arguably a respectable rogue status, as they would achieve a handful of regional tops in the second half of 2019. In addition to this, and more surprisingly, at least in my opinion, we also saw one player reach the top 32 cut at YCS Milan, Italy, held in December. 2 duelists did have some excellent regional top 4 finishes in the first months of 2020, but in March, Yugioh pretty much shut down worldwide. So oddly enough, the arrow might be pointing up for Musketeers, at least in the TCG. As it stands in 2021, I think fans of the archetype know very well of the problems that the theme has, but are optimistic. While Musketeers failed miserably to reach the bar set for them, as they were hyped as the next Zoodiac and easily a tier 1 deck, etc., etc., they've actually performed better in the TCG despite a worse card pool. In my opinion, the archetype still has some incredibly strong spells and traps and one hell of a good Link 1 monster. I think best deck of the format is far out of reach, but we've already seen Musketeers top 32 of YCS have some dominant regional performances in the last year and completely outperform its OCG counterparts. I don't know how committed Konami is to the lore, as there are already 7 spells and traps for the archetype, which of course represent the 7 magic bullets given to Max in the story, and I believe all the other major characters in the play are accounted for. But lord be damned, if Konami gives Musketeers more support in the future, I believe that this deck could top again in the TCG. And with that, we are at the conclusion of our Yu-Gi-Oh story. If you enjoyed the video, or more importantly, you learned anything, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe if you have not already.